Hello everyone. Our lecture today is about the cerebellum, which is an important part of the brain. The cerebellum stands for the Latin words stands for the little brain, and this cerebellum, or this part of the brain, is located in the posterior aspect of the brain, and it plays an important role in the coordination of the motor activity. The cerebellum, as seen here in the picture, lies under the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, and also it is beneath or under the umbrella of what is called the tentorium cerebelli. Tentorium cerebelli is one of the neural reflections present here in the central nervous system. Also, as a localization of the cerebellum, the organ, the cerebellum, lies behind the brainstem and mainly behind the pons and the medulla oblongata. And in between them, we have a space here called the fourth ventricle. Now, the main function or functional aspect of cerebellum, this organ is concerning with the coordination of the motor activity, and also it is important to play a role in learning a skillful task and skillful performance, and also it have an important role in doing synchronization of the contraction of a group of muscles to perform an action. For example, a group of extensor muscles or adductor muscles. So these muscles within its group will act in a planned manner and in a synchronized way regarding the power, regarding the tone, and regarding the contractions. We might say that the cerebellar function is also concerning with the smoothing of the responses by regulating the grading of the muscle tension and contraction. Has a role also in equilibrium and balance, and even in the body posture. Keep in mind, there is no role for the cerebellum in intelligence and even in conscious perception. Now, let us have some slides explaining the tips of the the cerebellar function and activity. Like this slide, you should remember that the cerebellum has a role in coordination of the motor activity, and this can be seen in the sport men when they are doing their motor performance during the sport games. Okay. Second important memorandum for you to see these pictures and remember them as an indication for the cerebellum and its role in learning of motor tasks and activities. When you are growing up, when the child is growing up, he will start to learn to do some skillful movements like those seen in the pictures. Now, as a configuration of the cerebellum, we can see in a section of cerebellum, we can see this configuration just like an what is called arbor vitae. Arbor vitae, just like a tree, branches of the tree, and you can see here مثل أغصان الشجرة. We can call this architecture or our configuration, we call it the arbor vitae cerebelli. Okay. Now, the cerebellum can be studied in three manners, or divided into three manners. Either we study the cerebellum anatomically, or we study the cerebellum according to the function, or according to the developmental stages of the cerebellum. So, anatomically speaking, we can say that we have gray matter and white matter. The outer cortex of the cerebellum is the gray matter containing the neurons, and the core of the cerebellum containing the white matter. And within this core of white matter, we have a group of nuclei, and the nuclei, you know that they are a group of neurons serving for a specific function. For example, here we have 4 pairs of deep cerebellar nuclei, namely they are vestigial nucleus, globus nucleus, emboliform, and the very famous nucleus called dentate nucleus. Now, the cortex of the cerebellum, as we mentioned, is thrown into folia and sulci. I mean, folds and depressions, like what happens in the cerebrum, like in هنا to a less extent, in a very little manner. So the folding called folia, والsingular تبع لها folium, والdepressions called sulci. The surface of the cerebellum is divided into 3 lobes by 2 important fissures, namely the primary fissure and the posterolateral fissure. Now, the idea behind presence of folia and sulci to increase the surface area of the cerebellar cortex. This is a very clear picture to show you the deep white matter, or the core of the cerebellum, the white matter, and embedded inside it the group of nuclei. They are in paired manner. We have right and left vestigial, globus, emboliform, and dentate nuclei. These nuclei, they are the great matter embedded inside the core of white matter of the cerebellum. Again, the primary fissure, this is the primary fissure, will divide the cerebellum into anterior and posterior lobe, and the posterolateral fissure on the inferior aspect of the cerebellum will divide or subdivide the posterior lobe into another lobe, what is called the flocculonodular lobe. Again, this profile picture of the cerebellum, we can see here the primary fissure dividing the cerebellum into anterior yellow and posterior, it is the green one, while the posterolateral fissure will subdivide it into the flocculonodular lobe. This flocculonodular lobe has a role in the regulation of muscle activity and maintaining equilibrium, and also maintaining the posture of the body. Now, the cerebellum, as we mentioned, located in the posterior canal fossa, and we have the brainstem in front of it, and in between we have the 4th ventricle. Now, the connections between the cerebellum and this brainstem in a 3 bundle of white matter. So the cerebellum is connected to the brainstem by 3 bundles. They are superior cerebellar peduncle, and the middle cerebellar peduncle, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and they are the connection between the cerebellum and midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, respectively. The same, this is this picture of the middle cerebellar peduncle. Well, lastly, the picture showing the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Now, another profile, lateral profile picture of the cerebellum, showing the connections between the part of the brainstem with the cerebellum, and this connection is the important one that conveying the informations from to cerebellum. Here we can see the histological picture, histological features of the and morphological feature of the cerebellum, and you can see here the core of the cerebellum is composed of white matter, the axons, the nerve fibers, while the cortex is composed of the cells of the neuron of the cell body, of the cell nerve cells. So here we have the collection of the neurons, the bodies of the neurons, and here we have the extensions of the axons, the nerve fiber of these neurons. So here we have the histological morphology of the cerebellum is showing that it's composed of an outer layer, outer matter, or the gray matter containing the neurons. We call it the cortex of the cerebellum, while the core of the cerebellum is mainly containing the white matter, the axons, and sometimes we have an embedded neurons there. We call them the nuclei, as we just mentioned them in the previous slides. Okay, this cerebellar cortex, histologically speaking, composed of 3 layers. The cortex composed of 3 layers: the molecular, the outer, the inner, the medullary, and in between we have what is called the granular layer that contains mainly the different types of cells. Now we can identify 6 types of cells within these 3 layers of cerebellum, and these type of cell play the main role of a function of the cerebellum, whether excitation or inhibition or even regulation of the motor orders. Now we will come across them in a fast way. The granular layer, the granular cell present in the granular layer, which is the second one, and they have an excitatory function. The neurons have excitatory function here. Now the other type of cell called the stellate cell and the basket cell, they are present within the molecular layer, which is the first layer, the more external layer, and these cells have an inhibitory synaptic connections with the Purkinje. The Purkinje cell, we will come across it just in a moment, is a very important functional cells of the cerebellum. So the stellate cells here have an inhibitory synapse with the Purkinje. So its role to inhibit the function of the Purkinje, or even the transmission of the orders through the Purkinje cell, while basket also have an inhibitory synaptic connection with the Purkinje. The third type of cells, we have the Golgi cells. They are larger in size and present in the granular cell layer near to the molecular. It means at the top of the granular layer تقريبا هاي جولجي سيل، هاي هي المنطقة اللي نسميها molecular، وهاي هي granular layer. تقريبا بالtop of the granular layer near the molecular layer we can find the what is called the Golgi cells. This Golgi cells has inhibitory activity within the cerebellum. We have also unipolar or called brush cell. They lie in the or within the granular layer of the cerebellum, and have a short single dendrites from the body, and also has what is called the mossy fibers that makes multiple synapses with this dendrites of the unipolar brush cell. So this cell has an excitatory activity on the function of the cerebellum. It has a strong excitatory activity on the orders of the cerebellum. The very important and known cell, Purkinje cell, it lies in the middle layer. It means in the granular layer, and this is the only output of the cerebellum. It means all the other cells should communicate with Purkinje in a way excite or inhibit the action or the function of the Purkinje, and the formulation of the order, the final order, the final order of the cerebellum will comes out from the Purkinje. by its communication with other cells that we mentioned just before. So the only output will comes out from the Purkinje cell, and this Purkinje cell has many communication and synapses with other cells, and even with other Purkinje cells nearby them. Now this Purkinje has ability to release what is called the GABA neurotransmitter, gamma amino butyric acid, very important neurotransmitter. And also this Purkinje cell can cause inhibition of the other cells nearby, like Purkinje, like the basket and the Golgi apparatus. In general, or in conclusion, the Purkinje cell can modulate the outputs, the neuronal outputs of the deep cerebellar nuclei and even the lateral vestibular nucleus. You can see here, this is the Purkinje cell, lies throughout the whole thickness of the cortex of the cerebellum, the body of the Purkinje within the second layer, dendrites within the molecular layer, while the axons within the deep layer of the cerebellum. It has communication with many cells that will end up with the formulation of the neural output of the cerebellum. You can see here the MOSI fiber, they are inhibitory fiber for the cells, also can be seen here in the picture. Now, in another way, we can study the cerebellum in a different way. We can divide the cerebellum into zones, into 3 zones: the middle zone or the median zone, the intermediate zone, and the lateral zone. This is the way of studying or division of cerebellum in a different way. The first one كانت على طريق الفيشرز، قلنا اكو primary fissure واكو posterolateral، وقسم لي الى anterior و posterior و folliculonodular lobe. Now the way is different، انه نقسم the cerebellum in a zonal manner. So the divisions will be median zone, including the vermis, the midline structure, the vermis, while the paramedian zone or paravermal zone, including these type of nuclei اللي هم interposed وglobus وemboliform nuclei. والlateral zone of the cerebellum هنا green is containing the dentated nucleus. These are deep nuclei of the cerebellum, and they are present within this division manner of the cerebellum. So each zone containing white matter and the gray matter, cortex and the core, and within the core of white matter also we have the nuclei we mentioned before. لكن الفكرة وين انه كل زون يحتوي على يعني مجموعة من الdeep nuclei or deep cerebellar nuclei. Now, if we take the middle zone or the midline zone, or even called the vermal zone, it might be consist of or comprised from the anterior and posterior part of the vermis, containing vestigial nucleus, and this zone, as a functional speaking, concerning with the maintaining the posture of the body and even the locomotion of the body, and also it controls the extraocular muscles. The muscles of the eyeball is under the control of this vermal zone. فقط ملاحظة, the motor activity, I mean the regulation of the motor activity and the motor action of these muscles, because you know the primary motor activity comes from the heart cerebrum, from the prefrontal cortex, pre-central gyrus, from the primary motor area, while the regulation and coordination of the motor activity is formulated here in the cerebellum. So the vermal zone will be concerned with the regulation and modulation of the motor activity of extraocular muscles. This zone can be diseased or defected, وبالتالي ممكن the patient will have an abnormal function of this zone, like an abnormality in the stance, in the posture, in the gait, and even it will have a ataxic gait, and also disturbance of the eye movement like sequent or nystagmus and so on. If we have what is called the Romberg test positive, this goes with disease of the vermal zone of the cerebellum, and also we can do a test for the patient, what is called the gait tandem. Ask the patient to walk in the clinic, and we can see the ataxic or the type of the gait or ataxia of the this zone disorder. Now, the second zone, more lateral to the midline, called the intermediate zone. This zone containing emboliform nucleus and the globus nucleus, concerning with the controlling the velocity of performing the motor activity, how fast we perform the activity, how fast we do the motor activity, and also the pattern of the muscle activity. The disorder related to this part, till now it is not very clearly known and explained. The lateral zone of the cerebellum, this part containing the dentate nucleus, the deep nucleus of the cerebellum, and this part is concerned with the planning of the movement in connection with the neurons in the region of Friolan of the cerebral cortex. I mean, by this lateral zone we can perform the planning of the motor activity. Once you decide to do a specific action, motor action, you should have a plan. For example, you are bringing a book from the archive, or you are putting something on the table, or bringing something from the table, or grasping something on the table nearby. This movement or this action should have a plan to do. So the planning of the motor activity is done here in the lateral zone of the cerebellum. The lesion might happen in this lateral zone, will end up with abnormality in controlling the skilled movements. The skilled movement. You know, the writing is a skilled movement. The writing is a skilled movement. So these movements, the skilled movements, can be disturbed due to the disease occur in the lateral zone of the cerebellum. Now, we can test for this disease in the lateral zone by doing finger nose test, also by what is called the heel shin test. Also, it is a sign or test to examine the function of the lateral zone. In general, we have a number of physical signs that can be seen in the patients with cerebellar disease, regardless the zone, whether lateral, intermediate, or vermal. So in general, we have a disease of hypotonia in the cerebellar disease, or ataxia, ataxic gait, abnormal gait, dysarthria, abnormal speaking or speech, tremor اللي هو fine tremor يكون, ocular motor dysfunction due to the disturbance of the extraocular muscles function, and also we might have also a problem with the posture, and also with the planning of doing motor activity. Okay. Again, to the anterior lobe and posterior lobe, functional speaking, this lobe lies rostral to the primary fissure. You can see it here. And functional speaking, this lobe is concerning with the posture maintaining or maintenance of the body, while the posterior lobe of the cerebellum, present here in this area, is concerned with the role of planning and programming the movement of like the muscle coordination during physical activity, like in exercise or even in the sport, and also in doing in playing a piano. This is a motor activity need a posterior lobe involvement. This slide explaining what's called the somatotopic maps of the presentation of the body in the neurons of the cerebellum, what we call it the homunculus. Even in the cerebrum, I think you have an idea about the homunculus of the cerebral presentation of the human body in upside down in the precentral motor gyrus. And here in the cerebellum we have two somatotopic maps, one posterior and the other anterior on each side, that represent the human body in a manner just like that. This is the cerebellum, هذا الvermal zone, هذا intermediate zone وهذا lateral zone. Here we have in the posterior part of the cerebellum we have the homunculus، يعني ممكن نسميها الصورة الشبحية ل human body, a representation of the human body in the cerebellar cortex. Like here also we have in the anterior part we have two homuncular representation of the human body. Just an important note that the cerebellar input is more than the cerebellar output. That is to say, the cerebellum receiving 3 times informations and knowledge and afferent input more than the cerebellar orders and outputs. Now, these cerebellar input or even the output comes through these bundles we mentioned, the middle cerebellar peduncle and also the superior, and each one have its own type of tracts that terminates in the cerebellum. For example, here the superior cerebellar peduncle that communicate between the midbrain and the cerebellum. It contains fibers of the anterior spinocerebellar fibers that terminate in the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, that's concerned with the posture activity of the body. The spinocerebellar fibers that comes from the spinal region and send its informations to the anterior lobe of the cerebellum via this tract. Now the output of the cerebellum arising from the deep nuclei of the cerebellum, we mentioned them, الدنتيت nucleus اللي more lateral والامبوليفورم والجلوبس باليس الامبوليفورم والدنتيت nuclei. These deep nuclei of the cerebellum will formulate the main output of the cerebellum, and they have an excitatory activity on the target organs and tissues. Also, we have an important note here about the function of the cerebellum, that the cerebellar hemisphere controlling the ipsilateral side of the body. You know the cerebellum is composed of two cerebellar hemispheres, and in between the connecting stalk between these two hemispheres we call it the vermis. So the two hemispheres, whether right or left, controlling the ipsilateral side of the human body. And also the function of the cerebellum is exerted through this knots They are controlling the ipsilateral side. And also the cerebellum play its function and has a double crossing. The cerebellum controlling the ipsilateral side via the presence of double crossing. The first cross, when you have the ascending fibers, comes from for example the spinal cord. These ascending fibers will decussate through the superior cerebellar peduncle. And the second decussation, when the descending fibers comes from higher centers, for example descending corticospinal and cerebrospinal tract, they are also decussating, and you know that 90% of the corticospinal tracts is crossing to the other side. So this double crossing will give the cerebellar function this integrity that control the ipsilateral side. A few points about the blood supply of the cerebellum. The cerebellum is vascularized by three main sources: the superior cerebellar artery and the inferior cerebellar artery from the anterior branch of it, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. These two arteries, they are branches of the basilar artery, while the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, it is a branch, comes from the vertebral artery and supplying the posterior and inferior aspect of the cerebellum and even the folliculonodular lobe, because we should know the area supplied by these arteries or branches, because the main insult in the cerebellum could be vascular due to decreased blood supply or thrombosis and so on, or hemorrhage here, and this will affect the area of the cerebellum. وبالتالي it will give specific signs and symptoms and disorder of the cerebellum. In general, إذا واحد يفهم ال disease of the cerebellum, we should know that the cerebellar lesions will cause what is called the release phenomena of the motor activity of the body. It means we have loss of the negative feedback, because the higher centers give the primary motor orders. The primary motor orders comes from the higher centers, from the primary motor cortex, and this orders or high amplitude orders should be modulated, should be smoothening, should be inhibited in a less extent, should be planned by the action of the neurons of the cerebellum. So if we have a disease of cerebellum, we will lose this inhibitory and regulatory and modulatory activity of the order comes from the primary motor area. So we will have release phenomena, كأنما أنت يعني فقدت السيطرة على الإيعاز that comes from the higher center. وبالتالي راح تحس إنه المريض عنده like a tremor, over activity, over excitation when trying to do motor activity like touching an object or grasping an object. So the intention tremor or cerebellar tremor, we call it, هو dyskinetic disorder characterized by a broad and coarse and low frequency movement, or what is called tremor. Now, the main application of the cerebellar disease is due to its vascular lesions. وبالتالي most of the lesions of the cerebellum could be happens due to vascular insult, happens in the branches that supplies the part of the cerebellum. These are manifestations of the vascular injury of the cerebellar tissue, and the most striking feature of the cerebellar disease is what is called the cerebellar ataxia, and we should differentiate this type of ataxia from the dorsal column ataxia. Dorsal column ataxia and the cerebellar ataxia. Here the patient has ataxic gait, and when we have these features. The patient is swaying to the right in a standing position. This is goes with the cerebellar ataxia, and also it is steady on the right leg. If the patient have a lesion in the left cerebellum to start with, we will have these features. So the patient have diseased left cerebellar part, diseased left cerebellar hemisphere. So the patient, when stand, he will sway to the right side, and also the patient will be steady if standing on the right leg, and it is unsteady if it is stand on the left leg, on the ipsilateral side of the disease, and the movement or walking will be just like this manner in the picture as seen here. وبالتالي هنسمي the ataxic gait or cerebellar ataxia. Okay, now he is steady on the right, he is unsteady on the left, he is steady on the standing position and swaying to the right if he has left disease of the cerebellum. And this is the movement of the patient with cerebellar ataxia. This is the whole story about the cerebellum, and I am ready for any questions or inquiry you have, and you can just send them and I will reply as soon as I can. I hope you have get the benefit from the lecture, and see you in the next series of lectures. Thanks and good luck.